Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Implementing a VPN Service lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. We'll kickstart this lesson with a broad understanding of what makes a virtual private network tick, and we'll talk about the VPN types that are supported in Threat Management Gateway. Next, we'll go through all of the configuration options with regard to enabling and configuring Threat Management Gateway's VPN capability. Then we'll talk about how to configure the VPN client properties from the Threat Management Gateway server itself. And we'll wrap up this lesson with a demonstration on implementing a VPN service that will meet the needs of GlobalMantics. With an increasingly mobile workforce, GlobalMantics requires general virtual private network-based remote access for many of these remote employees. You've been assigned to implement Threat Management Gateway for this purpose for the company. From an outcomes perspective, by the end of this lesson, you'll have learned about the different types of VPNs that are available, and you'll learn how to implement a basic VPN with Threat Management Gateway. Let's start with some basics around VPNs. First of all, as companies open branch offices, point-to-point solutions can be expensive to procure. So for example, GlobalMantics has its headquarters, but then it decides to open up a new office that might be in another state or even another country. A point-to-point solution such as a T1 line or direct fiber connection between the two facilities can be an incredibly expensive option, although it does provide the most stable connection that's out there. As such, there needs to be a better, more financially expedient way to accomplish the goal of connectivity between remote offices and headquarters. But most importantly, an increasingly mobile workforce makes it next to impossible to make use of fixed point-to-point services in any meaningful way. So you might have people that are going to an office to work where they could use a point-to-point connection that doesn't require any special routing over the internet, but more than likely, employees are going to be working from their homes, from the local Starbucks, from McDonald's, or from wherever they can get quick access to the internet. Today's highly distributed workloads rely heavily on the use of the highly insecure public internet. Now that might not sound very smart, but it actually, when it comes down to it, is really the best option many companies have. Companies will need methods by which branch offices and the mobile workforce can securely access internal corporate resources. A virtual private network provides a secure, encrypted tunnel over a public network, giving the appearance of a direct, secure connection that, in actuality, uses the public internet as its transport mechanism. So basically what happens is the computer that is initiating a VPN connection to a VPN host believes it has a secure, uninterrupted, point-to-point tunnel between it and the host, when in reality there may be an incredibly complex network lined underneath. You may have already kind of guessed that there are a couple of different types of VPNs that are available for your use, depending on the needs that you need to accomplish. First of all, a single client can establish a VPN connection for use by that client only, and this is the method that's going to be used by the GlobalMantics mobile sales force, and the method we'll be focusing on in this course. But there's that second type, that site-to-site VPN that I kind of alluded to earlier. This is where a VPN tunnel is established between two physical sites, for example, a remote office and headquarters. Basically, what happens in this case is these two networks merge into one network that are connected by the VPN tunnel as if it were any other network link. So basically, any computers that are on the remote side of the equation, in the branch office or the remote office, can seamlessly interact with the computers that are on the headquarters network, in fact, servers or other services that are available, as if they were directly connected by a direct link. And that's the beauty of a VPN. You can actually set up the appearance of a direct link without the cost of a direct link. But you have to make sure you do so in a relatively secure way, or you can leave the company open to some pretty nasty things. For example, if you don't properly secure that site-to-site VPN, hackers can get into the network and you can expose yourself on both sides of the equation. So it's important to make sure that you secure your VPN connection so that you don't end up with a security breach as a result of this highly mobile and really desirable remote access type. Let's take a look at the three significant VPN types that are supported by Threat Management Gateway. The first and honestly most common VPN type is called the point-to-point tunneling protocol, or PPTP. And this one is the simplest to configure and deploy and also enjoys the broadest operating system support. Now, what do I mean by that? That means that most of the operating systems that you're going to run into out there will support establishing PPTP connections to a VPN host. Other to a VPN may not be as well supported, and that's something you have to keep in mind as you deploy a VPN service. Is what are you going to do on the client side? You can take the step of buying a dedicated VPN device and then sending out to your users instructions for installing a client. However, this is not always feasible, and from an economics perspective is not always the route that a company wants to go. But from a security perspective, it may be the right way to go. PPTP is the least secure of the three options due to the point at which authentication takes place, which is before encryption is fully kicked in. PPTP has been the subject of a lot of security reviews, and it's relatively flawed when it comes to overall security, but it remains highly used because of its simplicity and flexibility and the sheer base of support that it enjoys. Next up, we have the Layer 2 tunneling protocol over IPsec, often called IPsec. This is a much more comprehensive protocol than PPTP, and it uses the SSL certificates or pre-shared keys to work its magic. L2TP over IPsec provides the highest level of security and flexibility, as it supports both individual machine connections via VPN and point-to-point VPN connections. It does, however, require the implementation of a public key infrastructure, which places it out of reach for many organizations, including GlobalMantics. Next up, we have the Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, or SSTP. This uses PPP, similar to PPTP, but instead of being its own protocol like PPTP is, it uses the standard point-to-point protocol, which is then wrapped inside an SSL encrypted HTTPS packet. SSTP is only used to connect individual machines to a VPN client or VPN host. You cannot use SSTP for site-to-site purposes. SSTP, from a security perspective, is better than PPTP, and it also gets around some other issues that we'll talk about a little bit later. You'll find that PPTP is by far the cheapest and easiest solution to actually implement, but it may not be the easiest to support. The reason is because some locations, hotels are notorious for this, will allow only HTTP and HTTPS traffic to traverse their network, making PPTP impossible in those instances. The reason is because the PPTP protocol does not ride inside HTTP or HTTPS. It is its own protocol. So it's actively blocked by a number of hotels. So that's where SSTP comes in. It does use HTTPS as its underlying communication mechanism. However, this protocol has less support in operating systems due to its younger age. Again, PPTP has been around for a very long time. If you choose to use SSTP, you may find it necessary to upgrade to only operating systems that support SSTP if you want to go ahead and use this protocol. And that's something you'll have to do as part of your cost-benefit analysis when it comes time to deploy a VPN. For GlobalMantics, the company is going to use PPTP because of the fact that they can get it implemented relatively easily and quickly. When users travel to hotels, they're actually not using the hotel network. Every GlobalMantics employee is issued a smartphone with tethering, so they're actually making use of the tethered network on the cellular network provider, so they don't have to worry about some of the limitations that they have with regard to the use of HTTP and HTTPS on hotel networks. We're now going to walk through the steps that you are necessary to take in order to implement VPN under Threat Management Gateway, and then we're going to move on to a demonstration for how to implement a VPN service for GlobalMantics. The first step when it comes to deploying a VPN with Threat Management Gateway is to work on the network side of the equation, setting up the service on the Threat Management Gateway server. And to do this, you're going to see when we go over to the Threat Management Gateway system that one of the navigation items is Remote Access Policy VPN. This allows you to establish the VPN type under Threat Management Gateway. And when you're there, if you choose Select Access Networks, you'll get a screen very much like the one you see on your screen right now, with 4 tabs across the top labeled Access Networks, Address Assignment, Authentication, and Radius. These 4 tabs provide you with 1/2 of the configuration items that are necessary to fully implement VPN in Threat Management Gateway. And your first order of business is to choose a network from which virtual private network connections are allowed to originate, and that happens on the Access Networks tab. As you can see, the external network in this particular example is selected, and this is by far the most common network that you're going to find for this purpose, because most VPN connections should originate from the external network, not from the internal network. Just like all the machines on the internal network and on all of your other networks for that matter, any machines that connect via VPN must have an IP address assigned to them that works. And this is the job of the Address Assignment tab that you see on your screen here. You get to choose how you want to assign IP addresses. You get to connect via VPN. You can have the VPN server itself, in this case Threat Management Gateway, hand out addresses based on a pool that you provide. This is a static IP address range. Or you can use existing DHCP services. So if you've already got a DHCP server, you can configure it to provide IP addresses out to the clients that connect via VPN. Should you choose to use a static IP addresses range, make sure that you have enough addresses in your pool. If you create a start address and end address that don't include enough addresses for all potential clients to connect, Threat Management Gateway will throw an error. And I'm going to do this intentionally in a little bit to show you what I mean. But by default, Threat Management Gateway expects to see an IP address range that includes at least 100 IP addresses, because by default, that's the number of connections that the VPN service allows in Threat Management Gateway, although that number is adjustable upward or downward. So make sure you have enough addresses in that pool so that you can get beyond this screen. Other services, such as DNS and DHCP and WINS and all that stuff, are generally available on an organization's internal network. But you have to tell the VPN service which network these services reside on, even if it's just the internal network, because the remote VPN services, the remote VPN client, will make use of these services, and Threat Management Gateway has to know to which network that information or that traffic should be directed. And if necessary, you should define advanced name resolution options, and you probably will need to do this if you choose the static address pool, because this includes things like DNS servers and WINS servers. And we're going to do all this again in just a couple of minutes when we demonstrate how to set up a virtual private network for Global Mantics. Also on the server side of the equation, you have to choose your authentication option. The default is to use the Microsoft Encrypted Authentication version 2 or MS Chat v2 with your VPN service. And this is well supported again out there by Windows operating systems, which are the most common ones you're going to run across. You can also choose from EAP, which is Extensible Authentication Protocol, with a smart card or some kind of other certificate. Again, you need a certificate infrastructure for that one to operate as well as you'd like. Then you have CHAP, which is this encrypted authentication. This requires passwords that are reversible, which is a pretty significant security risk. And PAP, which is unencrypted passwords. You should not use those when you don't have to. By using the encrypted authentication, you actually protect yourself just a tad, because the negotiation for authentication will be encrypted, whereas with something like PAP, it will not be, and passwords will traverse the internet in the clear, leaving the organization at very significant risk for those passwords being sniffed out and used by nefarious denizens of the underworld. Next up, if you have a Radius server, this is an authentication server. You can choose to enable that server here. So if you'd like to use Radius, simply select the checkbox next to Use Radius for Authentication, and if you want to use Radius for accounting to log VPN connection information, you can do that as well. Global Mantics will not be setting these options right now. We'll be using Active Directory for our authentication later on in this lesson. Now you have to configure how clients are supposed to interact with your VPN server, and to do this you again go to the Remote Access Policy area, and in the Tasks pane we'll click Configure VPN Client Access, and we're going to see this in action in just a minute, but I want to just run through the options before we go through and create the VPN service for Global Mantics. The first option you have is to choose whether or not VPN client access should be enabled at all. Well, I think that if you want the VPN access to work, you should probably enable it. And you have to specify the maximum number of VPN client connections that are allowed. By default, this is 100. This will be dependent on hardware and network limitations. If you're using something slow like a T1 line, you may not want to have a maximum of 100 VPN connections, maybe just 2 or 3. And again, if you're running your threat management gateway system on a really small piece of hardware, you may want to limit the number of connections as well. Global Mantix is going to limit the connections to 50 later on in this lesson. In order to provide for a more secure service, you can tell Threat Management Gateway which domain groups are allowed to access VPN-based services. As you can see in the screenshot, we see domain admins there. That's simply a placeholder test. By default, no groups have access. If you want to add a group, you simply click the Add button and then choose a group you'd like to use for this purpose. You then manage group membership via Active Directory users and computers, and this is a pretty common security methodology. Rather than putting individual usernames into a screen like this, you use groups so that other people can manage those group lists for you. Basically, you're delegating the authority a little bit so that you don't have a single point of failure anywhere along the line, and you're using a common set of tools to define security parameters across the organization. In this case, those security parameters or those memberships are being defined in Active Directory users and computers. Next up, you have to choose the VPN protocols you'd like to support. By default, the first time you hit this screen, PPTP will be enabled. The other two will be disabled as they require additional configuration in order to operate. If you choose SSTP, you'll have to create a listener as well. Remember, SSTP is based on HTTPS. You'll learn earlier in this course that incoming HTTPS traffic requires a listener in order to be able to access internal resources. So if you choose to enable SSTP, you'll have to go through the process of creating a listener, which is an identical process to the one we went through earlier in this course. On the User Mapping tab, you can enable user mapping. With certain configurations, you may need to map users to your Active Directory namespace so that users can authenticate from their local machines. On this space, if you need to do that, you'll select the checkbox next to Enable User Mapping, and then in the domain name field, you would put in globalmantix.com. The Threat Management Gateway VPN service also includes something called a quarantine. Threat Management Gateway can quarantine VPN clients until they've been run through a network access protection, which is a Windows feature that checks clients to make sure that they meet specific requirements, such as having the latest antivirus, the latest Windows patches, and things like that. It's an additional security mechanism that you can put into place in order to ensure the health of clients. If you choose to do this, select the checkbox next to Enable Quarantine Control. And if you do enable Quarantine Control, you can exempt specific users from quarantine by adding their names to the list at the bottom of the screen. Implementing network access protection is well beyond the scope of this course, and Global Mantix does not require this feature. So what does Global Mantix need? First of all, Global Mantix has simple, modest VPN needs. So they're going to enable a PPTP-based VPN that enables support for up to 50 remote users. They'll use a static IP range. They'll allow access to anyone that is a member of the GM Mobile Active Directory group. So we'll have to create that Active Directory group in Active Directory. And access via VPN is allowed only from the external network. This is pretty common. Users will use Active Directory as the authentication source, and the authentication protocol will be MS-CHAP v2. Once the server side of the configuration is complete, Global Mantix will test the service from an external machine to make sure that it operates. As you can see at the top of the screen, we're actually on a domain controller right now. We're going to create that group called GM Mobile. So I'm going to just go to the users OU. I'm going to right-click users, and I'm going to choose New Group. I'm going to call it GM-Mobile. I don't like spaces and names. And this is going to be a global security group. And we'll click OK. Now I want to put a couple users in this group. So I want to put Scott Lowe and Administrator. So from a member's perspective, I'll click Add, and I'll add Scott Lowe. And I'll add Administrator. I'll actually add all domain admins. This gives us the group that we're going to use for allowing access to the VPN service. Now, we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server, and we're going to continue the configuration. So here we are at the Threat Management Gateway console, and you'll notice that I've gone to the Remote Access Policy VPN navigation area. In the middle pane, we have two tabs. We have VPN Clients, which is where we're going to be spending most of our time, and remote sites. The remote sites tab is where you can create and modify site-to-site VPN connections, but we're not going to be doing that in this course. We're focused on clients. You're going to notice that you can be walked through step by step a lot of the process if you like, or you can use the tasks area to choose which options you'd like to work on first. I'm going to use the tasks area, and I'm going to start by choosing select access networks, which is under general VPN configuration. We talked earlier about the fact that the external network is generally the one you're going to have selected here. So I've got the external network selected, which is exactly what I want. This is the network from which VPN connections will originate. Next, we have the address assignment tab, and we have to choose which kind of assignment we'd like to use, static or dynamic host configuration protocol, or DHCP. GlobalMantics is going to use a static pool. So I'm going to click the Add button, and I'm going to let the Threat Management Gateway server hand out the addresses. And I have to use an IP address range that doesn't overlap with anything I'm already using. So I'm going to have to find a new range here of 50 addresses. Why 50? Because that's the number of remote VPN tunnels that I want to support. Now, other services such as DHCP, DNS, and WINS are present on the internal network for GlobalMantics, but I have to make some additional configuration changes in order to make them all work. I'll go to the Advanced tab, and you'll see why. I'm not using DHCP, so therefore I can't get DNS servers via DHCP. So I'll click Use the following DNS server addresses, and I'll click Browse. And I'm going to locate the DNS server that I want to use. And I chose dc1.globalmantics.com, and there's the IP address of that server. I don't even have to remember the IP address, 10.1.1.254. And we're not using WINS for anything. I'll just simply do the same thing just to put an entry there. And then I'll click OK. And that's it for that tab. We now have an IP address range, and we've configured the advanced settings. Next, we have to choose authentication. We talked about these earlier. We're going to use MSCHAP v2. We're not going to worry about any of the other authentication options right now. And we don't have to configure any radius information. That'll all become clear soon when we choose how we're going to authenticate, which we've already done for the MSCHAP v2. Next up, we want to configure VPN client access. Here's where we're going to choose which domain groups we're going to allow access to this VPN service. So I'll click Add, and I got to choose from the directory, globalmantics.com, and it's going to be gm-mobile. We're going to allow only PPTP. We're not going to worry about L2TP or SSTP in this lesson. And we don't need to worry about user mapping or quarantine. We're not going to be using quarantine for GlobalMantics, and user mapping we're not worried about because we're using a Windows namespace, which is Active Directory, for our authentication. Now, I want to enable VPN access for 50 clients. And then I'll click OK. And it's going to tell me that in order for some of this to happen, I may have to restart some of the forefront threat management gateway computers in the array. But it'll tell me if that's the case. And you're going to notice if I had just gone through these items, it's just going to bring me to open different tabs at different places in those screens we just looked at. And if I had a radius server, it would just bring me to the radius tab. I can verify VPN properties. There's a whole bunch of things I can do. Now let's apply our settings so that we can restart the firewall with these new configuration changes and have our VPN service up and running. Now, we're going to go over to a client and we're going to test our VPN connection to see if it actually works. You'll notice that I'm already at the external machine. I'm at a Windows 7 external host. And I'm going to go to Control Panel, which I've already done, and choose Network and Sharing Center. And this should look pretty familiar if you've used Windows 7. But I'm going to choose the Set up a new connection to a network option. And I'm going to connect to a workplace. And click Next. I want to use my internet connection to do so. And the IP address is 192.168.160.2, which is the external IP address of the network adapter at GlobalMantics. And then we'll call this GM Remote. And then I'll click Next. Username is going to be slow. Put the domain here. And click Connect. And we'll see what happens. It's verifying the username and password to make sure that I actually have access to connect to this VPN. You notice it's first trying SSTP to see if that's going to work. And it's going to run through a bunch of different VPN connection options until it hits one that works. So it starts out by seeing if it's going to use SSTP. And this time it hit PPTP, and then you'll notice that it's now registering my computer on the network. And I am now officially connected to Global Mantics. And here we are, GM Remote, which is exactly what we wanted to see. It was that easy, folks, to set up the network. We started out with a brief discussion about virtual private networks from a high level, and then make sure you understand a couple different VPN types and what the pros and cons are of each type. We then ran through a list of all of the configuration options with regard to the threat management gateway-based virtual private network options. And then you learned about configuring VPN client properties. We then wrapped up the lesson with a discussion and a demonstration about how to enable a PPTP-based VPN in Threat Management Gateway, and then we successfully connected to that VPN using an external client, just as it would be the case for a Global Mantics employee. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.